Hello everyone and welcome to the Unanswered Questions True Crime Podcast.
I have spent hours and hours investigating this.
He basically told her that people have been killed. Journalists, independent investigators, people like that disappeared. It frightened her to the bone.
There's more to the story than meets the eye.
There were rumors of torture and homicide and sexual abuse, all sorts of egregious, horrendous crimes.
He was polygraphed 3 times. Each of those 3 showed evasions.
His resumes were a skeleton of truth.
He was mad at the world, and particularly mad at the government.
The study that he commissioned had described a fictional terrorist attack.
If people have died over this, it means you're getting close to the truth.
You don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to say, what the fuck?
Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of my new podcast, Unanswered Questions, where every week we will endeavour to discuss a mysterious unsolved case that has many lingering unanswered questions. So I hope you enjoy, and as always leave me some feedback on what you think about the show and rate it as well. Now on to the show. This week we'll be talking about the mysterious death of Dave Bocks. Now 39-year-old Dave Bocks of Loveland, Ohio worked as a pipefitter at the 1,050-acre feed materials production center in the small community of Fernald, Ohio. The facility was run by a private company called National Lead of Ohio, N.L.O, Fernald, and the facility lie in the midst of Farm County, 20 miles northwest of Cincinnati. For many years, Fernald's main employer was the facility. The casual observer would never guess that the facility and N.L.O were in fact owned by the Department of Energy. From 1953 to 1989, it was one of the few facilities in the United States that secretly processed high-grade uranium for use in nuclear weapons. Former employee Harry Easterling said that when he was hired there, he was told that it was a low-level radiation plant, that he did not have to worry about anything, and that there was nothing there that would bother him. He was also told not to tell anybody about what he was doing there and that everything would be fine. However, conditions in the facility were anything but fine, as we're about to get into. In the fall of 1984, N.L.O was rocked by a scandal of major proportions when an accident at the facility allowed a massive dose of radioactive smoke to escape into the atmosphere. An investigation later revealed that over the years the facility had released more than 200 tons of radioactive dust particles into the air and local water sources. Some said that the facility was in essence the third largest nuclear waste dump in the United States. It was later revealed that the government officials who oversaw the facility knew about these issues but did nothing to prevent or fix them. They also reportedly lied to the employees and local residents about health risks from the facility. One employee brought in to oversee safety there found several serious issues. He said that half of the facility's routine maintenance operations were terribly inadequate. Many of the managers did not seem to take his concerns seriously. Investigative reporter D.C. Cole researched N.L.O and the facility for several years. He said that the environmental disaster was just one thing. He thought that if someone did a survey around the Fernald community, they would find that very few people trust the government now.
The effect that it has on the environment is one thing. We have an environmental disaster, but I think if you did a survey around the Fernald community, you will find very few people who trust the government now.
For the people of Fernald, the disastrous accident followed on the heels of another very disturbing controversy involving the N.L.O. A few months earlier in June 1984, David disappeared while on the job. Though his body was never found, some of his personal effects were, and he was presumed dead. After the accident, his case took on a new, sinister dimension. He had worked at the facility for 3 years, and all evidence indicates that he died a horrible, gruesome death there. The official ruling by police and the company was that no foul play was involved, but his friends and family were convinced that he was murdered, and they vowed not to rest until they learned how he died and who was responsible. Now, Dave Bocks was born in Staten Island, New York in 1944. When he was a child, he and his family moved to Ohio. In 1966, he married Carleen Nogler. The couple had 2 sons, Tony and Matt, and a daughter, Casey. In 1979, they divorced, yet Dave remained devoted to Caroline and their children. In 1981, he was hired by N.L.O as a pipefitter in the facility's maintenance department. He quickly earned the trust and respect of his co-workers. Casey said he was a great father and would do anything for them. She said he was a kind as can be, loved his children, and did his job well.
He was great. He would do anything for us. Kind as can be, loved his children, did his job. He was just a very kind person.
Now, Dave worked the graveyard shift midnight to 8:30 a.m. at the facility. Monday, June 18th, 1984 began like any other evening for him. At 11 p.m. he met his rideshare partner Harry Easterling in the parking lot of a local White Castle restaurant. On that night, Harry drove them in his truck to the facility, and Harry said they had a little conversation along the way. Dave talked about his vacation with his children and said that he had bought a new lunchbox for work. Harry said everything seemed normal.
Dave got into my truck, we left, had a little conversation on the way to work. He had talked about vacation with his kids and bought a new lunchbox for work, and everything seemed to be normal.
Dave's primary responsibilities at the facility were to inspect and maintain equipment in all of its plants. This included making sure that the safety pumps and dust collectors used in the uranium processing were in proper working order. Since the facility was 30 years old, much of the equipment needed maintenance. Harry said that Dave was a fairly quiet guy, but if they worked on a job together, he would make sure to tell Harry to be careful if they were working with something dangerous and or radioactive. He tried to help Harry out as much as he could because he'd been there longer.
Dave was a fairly quiet guy, but if you worked on a job and say it was high radiation level, Dave would tell you, that particular dust collector is fairly radioactive, so watch yourself, or that pump has a certain kind of acid in it, so be careful when you work on it. But he would, try to help you out as much as he could because he'd been there longer than I had.
Only the maintenance crew and security personnel were on duty during the graveyard shift. The production lines were shut down once Dave and Harry arrived at the facility at around 11:25 p.m. They dropped off their personal belongings in the storage area, changed into their work clothes, and stepped through a sanitizing shower. At midnight, Dave and Harry reported to the maintenance room for their work assignments. On that night, Dave was assigned to look at the pump in Plant 8. His supervisor, Charlie Schaus, told him to talk to another co-worker about the exact pump he needed to look at. Harry said it was just like any other night. Dave opened his toolbox, left his keys in the padlock, and laid the lock and the keys on top of the toolbox. Harry said that Dave went to work in Plant 8 while he worked on a job in another plant in the facility.
It was sort of just like any other night. He would open his toolbox, leave his keys in his lock, and lay the lock and the keys on the top of the toolbox.
You know what you're doing?
Dave went to one area, and I worked on a job in another plant.
At around 4 a.m., Dave and Schaus were seen in a parked pickup truck by another employee who was never named. This unknown witness said that Dave appeared to be having a serious discussion with Schaus, but he could not determine what they were talking about. Oddly, the windows of the truck were rolled up, despite the fact that it was a hot and humid night. Shortly afterwards, Dave and Harry went on their lunch break, and at 4:46 a.m., they clocked back in and went their separate ways. About 15 minutes later, at 5 a.m., the same witness who saw Dave in the truck ran into him on the facility grounds. He told Dave he could help him with his work if he needed it. Dave responded, quote, "Oh, okay, no problem," end quote. The witness was struck by the fact that Dave was walking towards Plant 4 and not Plant 8, where he had been assigned. Shortly afterwards, Schaus ran into Dave in Plant 4 and talked to him for about 10 minutes. What they discussed, we don't know. They then parted ways. It was the last time Dave was seen alive. Later that morning, Harry became suspicious about Dave's absence. He said that at approximately 7 a.m. they had a safety meeting in a conference room in Plant 4. Dave did not show up for it. After it was over, Harry went to the maintenance room and put his tools away. He noticed at that point that Dave's toolbox was still open with the keys and locks still inside. Harry figured that Dave was probably just working overtime. He went and made a few phone calls, but he was unable to locate Dave. He had an appointment after work and did not want to be late for it, so he decided to leave Dave a note saying he would come back later. But when he returned, Dave was still not there. He told the security guard that Dave had not come out, he was going home, and he would meet Dave the next night at the restaurant. He also left another note, quote, "Dave, waited till 10:45, finally went home, sorry," end quote.
Approximately 7 o'clock that morning, we had a safety meeting in a conference room in Plant 4. We showed up for the meeting, but Dave wasn't there. Walked back over to the maintenance building, put my tools away, and noticed that Dave's toolbox was still open. So I thought, well, he's probably working overtime. So I went in and made a few phone calls, but I couldn't locate him, so I went back out and told the security guard at the desk that Dave hadn't come out, I was going home, and I would meet him the next night at the restaurant.
At around 7:30 a.m. that same morning, a furnace operator in Plant 6 notified his supervisor that the molten salt in the furnace's lid were covered with a strange black sticky residue. The operator also detected an unusual odor. The supervisor was not concerned in the least and told him to keep working. Oddly enough, the operator, however, was insistent that something was inside. He said whatever it was, it kind of looked like a leg. Very weirdly, the supervisor apparently found nothing wrong and told the operator to go back to work. At 11 p.m. that night, Harry arrived at the restaurant to meet Dave as usual. He had not heard about what happened in Plant 6. It was Dave's turn to drive and his car was already there. Harry said that was not out of the ordinary because Dave would normally park his car and then go into the restaurant to get something to eat or take for lunch the next day. When Harry leaned up against Dave's car, he noticed that the fender was still cold. He reached over, touched the hood, and noticed that it was still cold as well.
Wasn't anything out of the ordinary because he would pull his car in and go get something to eat and then come back to the car or get something to take for lunch. And I leaned up against Dave's car and I noticed the fender was still cold. So I reached over, touched the hood, and the hood was still cold.
Harry then began to suspect that something was wrong. When he arrived at the facility, he reported Dave missing and had a security guard pry open Dave's locker. Inside were the clothes Dave was wearing the night before. A search of the facility was then conducted, however no trace of him was found. Company officials then called the police. It was soon discovered that Dave had never clocked out that morning. Casey said that she and the family were told on Tuesday night that he was missing. On Wednesday, Carlene tried to contact the N.L.O and the facility to find out more information. They told her that they could not give her any information because they did not know anything, but inside the facility, an investigation was confirming the worst.
On Sunday night, he was missing. We were informed of the fact on Tuesday. On Wednesday, my mother tried to contact the plant to find out more information. They told her they couldn't give her any information, they didn't know anything, and that was that.
It was learned that at 5:10 a.m. on the morning of Dave's disappearance, around the time he was last seen, the temperature in the furnace in Plant 6, which was kept at a constant 1,350 degrees, had momentarily dipped 28 degrees twice, suggesting that something foreign had been dumped into it. An engineer noted that the time printed on the temperature readouts was about 10 minutes fast, meaning that the temperature drop occurred closer to 5 a.m. A worker had also found what appeared to be a piece of bone on the lip of the furnace. The Hamilton County Sheriff's Department was called in, and at 3 p.m. on Wednesday, the furnace was shut down. The investigators had to wait 3 days for the molten liquid inside the furnace to cool. Then, employees sifted through the waste material, searching for some kind of evidence. At one point, they found a set of keys. According to retired Chief Deputy Sheriff Victor Corelli, the keys belonged to Dave's car and 3 of his padlocks. Another key was believed to belong to his house, however, it was bent and in bad shape, so they were unable to ever prove that.
Those keys belong to the victim's car. They also belong to 3 padlocks of his, and one key we believed went into his residence, but we couldn't prove that because it was bent and not very good shape.
The conclusion was inescapable. Dave was almost certainly dead, but the news left Harry dumbfounded. He claimed that Dave's keys were still in his toolbox at 7:30 a.m., more than 2 hours after the gauge on Plant 6 registered the temperature drop. Harry said that when he went into the maintenance room that morning, Dave's keys were in the toolbox. When he left to go home, they were still in the box. When he came back that night, they were again still in the box. After Harry noticed the keys that night, one of the supervisors closed the toolbox, put the padlock on it, and took the keys out of the lock. After that point, Harry does not know what happened to the keys.
When I left the plant to go over to the maintenance shop, his keys were in the box. When I left there to go home, they were still in the box. I went home. When I came back that night, his keys were still in the top of his toolbox. The supervisor closed his box, put the lock on his toolbox, and took his keys out of the lock. And from there on, I do not know what happened to the keys.
In addition to the keys, investigators uncovered a steel toe and eyelet from a boot, part of what they thought was an eyeglass frame, fragments of what they believed was Dave's walkie-talkie, an alligator clip from a name tag, and a piece of stainless steel wire that was looped together in 3 oddly connected circles that no one has ever been able to figure out what it was. Also recovered were several pieces of human bone. The official police investigation was unable to determine conclusively how David had died. However, suicide was a distinct possibility, which I don't agree with. You see, the thing that complicated it was that Dave had a history of psychological problems and had been diagnosed with schizophrenia. He also suffered from hallucinations, and it has been noted that people with schizophrenia have higher rates of suicide than those without it. During his marriage, he also had problems with alcohol, and around the time of his divorce, he apparently tried to take his own life. Schultz also told police that Dave seemed despondent that night. Casey is certain that Dave did not commit suicide. She said there was no reason for him to do that. He was in perfect health, had recently remodeled his home, had purchased groceries and cigarettes for the week, and was planning a vacation with her and Matt for the following summer to Florida, and had paid all of his bills for the month. She had visited him the weekend before his death, and everything seemed normal. He had also not had a breakdown or a suicide attempt since the divorce. His psychiatrist also believed he was not suicidal.
I know my father did not commit suicide. There was no reason for him to commit suicide. He had purchased groceries for the week. He was planning a vacation with me and my younger brother for the following summer to Florida. He paid all of his bills for the month. There was no reason for him to commit suicide.
Former employee David Hay said that based on everything he knows about Dave, his death in the facility, he believed that Dave was probably lowered into the furnace. He believed that Dave was murdered. He cannot think of any other way it could have happened, and he does not believe it could have been a suicide or an accident, which I agree with.
From everything I know about the circumstances of what occurred back then, I would have to say that he was probably lowered into the furnace, that he was probably murdered. I can't think of any other way that it could have happened. I don't believe that it could have been suicide or that it could have been an accident.
An accident seems highly unlikely since the furnace is about 4 feet tall and the opening is on top. Dave would had to have climbed a ladder and dropped through a hole that was just 9 inches by 22 inches. The rest of the furnace was covered with this heavy steel lid. The furnace is also not in the part of the facility where Dave would normally be working, and suicide also seems unlikely. Doctors and scientists noted that Dave most likely would have died before he had a chance to maneuver his entire body through the hole on the night Dave died, and he had also been working in Plant 8. According to Cole, Plant 8 had released 4 times more radioactive contaminants into the environment than any other plant at the facility. Cole thought that Dave was killed because he knew something. He thought that Dave knew something about Plant 8 and about the release of the radioactive contaminants and the threat to public health and the environment. He said it was possible that Dave was a whistleblower or was going to be one.
On the night that Dave Bocks died, he had been working in Plant 8. Plant 8 had released 4 times more radioactive contaminants into the environment than any other plant at the plant site. Why he was killed, I think he knew something. And I think it had to deal with Plant 8. I think it had to deal with the releases, the threat to the public health and the environment. It's possible he was a whistleblower or was going to be a whistleblower.
According to his family and co-workers, Dave was a stickler for the rules kind of guy. He'd previously complained to Schaus about other employees sleeping on the job. Harry said that Dave knew about and often warned him about dangerous spots in the plants. His family believed he was going to be a whistleblower regarding the lax safety practices at the facility. Cole believed that Dave was either shot or knocked unconscious. His killers then took his body to Plant 6 and lowered him into the furnace using the looped wire. Cole wasn't sure if Dave was alive when he was put into the furnace. I mean, he hoped that Dave was not conscious. He couldn't imagine a more horrible death than that.
I believe that they could have either shot him or they could have hit him with something, knocked him unconscious. Took the body back to Plant 6, where the furnace is. The question I have is whether or not Dave Bocks was alive at the time that they threw him into that furnace. I would hate to think that he was conscious. I can't imagine a more horrible death than that.
He believed Dave's death was covered up by the N.L.O and the government. Dave's family believed he was killed, cut in half, and that each half was placed in the furnace. They believe that this explains the 2 separate temperature drops. Deputy Sheriff Corelli said that they never developed any information indicating foul play in Dave's case. He said they had in the back of their minds, but no one ever gave them any indication or reason to believe that it occurred.
We never developed any information indicating foul play. We had that in the back of our minds, but no one ever gave us any indication or reason to believe that foul play may have occurred.
Detective Pete Adrucci believes that Dave ran up the ladder and either jumped or dove into the small opening on the furnace. He said he does not believe homicide is possible in Dave's case, which I find absolutely incredible that he would say something like that. He claimed that if anyone else tried to put Dave's body in the furnace, they would have burned to death. Harry believed there are people who know what happened to Dave, however he wasn't sure if these people would ever come forward or tell anyone about it. He believed they may fear for their lives.
There are probably people out there that know what happened, and there may not be people that know what happened either, because, if they knew, I doubt that anybody would tell you. Fear of their life.
Casey said she still has days where she cannot believe Dave is gone. She is very angry about what happened, and she said that his family loved him and he loved them, and there was no reason for this to happen. They just wanted somebody to come forward and tell them any information he or she may have had about the case.
I still have days where I can't believe he's gone. I am very angry. I mean, we loved him, he loved us, and there was no reason for this to happen. We just want somebody to please come forward and tell us any information, anything at all.
In September of 1984, Dave's family tried to get him legally declared dead so that they could collect his estate. By that point, the police were no longer actively investigating the case. However, the coroner's office never issued a death certificate because of the lack of physical remains. In March 1986, a probate court declared him legally dead. There is a bitter final footnote to Dave's death that no one's ever gotten to the bottom of. Their various people have tried. The police tried, the local state coroner tried, and it never went anywhere. Years after the fact, his family is still waiting to lay him to rest. In 1989, the facility was shut down and his remains, a few bone fragments, are presently in a sealed drum on the closed plant site, too toxic to be buried in the ground. The question remains, did Dave commit suicide or was he murdered to keep him from talking? Unless new evidence is brought to light, the investigation is officially closed, but his family and friends are convinced that someone, somewhere, has that evidence. Now we get into the suspects in the case. One employee told police that he knew Dave's death was a murder and that he even knew the identity of his killer. The employee said that Dave's supervisor, Charles Schaus, knew a lot more than what he was saying. Another employee saw Dave and Schaus having a discussion in a vehicle at 4 a.m. that night. Schaus was reportedly the last person to see Dave alive. According to his own statement, Schaus was talking to Dave around the time that the temperature drop in Plant 6 occurred. His story about that night, though, differed from Harry's. He told police that Harry agreed with him about Dave seeming despondent, but Harry said that is not true. For reasons unknown, detectives never investigated him as a suspect. They also never asked him for his whereabouts at the time Dave died. Another potential suspect was the employee that Dave complained about shortly before he died, that being Ernie Gibson. Although Gibson was suspended on the night of Dave's death, a co-worker thought he saw Gibson's motorcycle at the facility. Police, however, went to his home and saw that the motorcycle was inoperable, so they dismissed the lead altogether. Problem was, though, they never asked him about his whereabouts that night or checked to see if he had access to other transportation. The other interesting fact was that several employees reported that drugs were sold at the facility. Casey said that Dave was against drugs. It was rumoured that Dave may have stumbled on a drug deal and been killed, and some believe that Dave was killed because he knew too much about the issues with the facility and was going to be a whistleblower. Another interesting point was there was also another worker who died at N.L.O, Harry Licks. He had died shortly after being accidentally doused with uranium particles. The company claimed at the time his death was unrelated to the accident. Some sources state that a piece of bone was spotted floating in the furnace, that the temperature dip occurred at 5:15 a.m, that the furnace was kept at least 1300 degrees, and that Dave's co-worker was the last person to see him. Sadly, Dave's brother Peter was killed by a hit-and-run driver while walking to work at a motel in Milford in January of 1988. The driver was never found. Dave's remains were later sent to a Nevada test site to be stored with other radioactive materials. Years after the Fernald facility was closed, the area was finally cleaned up and turned into a nature preserve. However, the site will never be clean enough for anyone to live there. In 2013, a study from the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, NIOSH, found that hourly workers at the facility had above average cancer mortality rates in comparison to the rest of the United States. However, the tests only provided evidence for a connection between hourly workers and intestinal cancer. In 2019, The Accused podcast investigated and profiled Dave's case in its third season. It included new interviews with several witnesses, investigators, and experts, and newly released documents and testimony from civil trials about N.L.O. Members of the podcast team also did an experiment with a replica of the furnace. They concluded it was impossible for Dave to have entered the furnace the way detectives believed he did by running up the ladder and jumping into the furnace's hole. They also felt that someone of Dave's size would have found it difficult, if not impossible, to force himself into the small hole, which I agree with. The podcast team also felt that the original investigators did not look into potential suspects seriously. 2 of the team members met with current Hamilton County Sheriff's Office investigators to discuss their findings. The investigators felt intrigued by the information and stated they were willing to reopen the case. Sadly, several of those close to the case have since passed away, including Dave's ex-wife Carolyn, his brother Paul, Deputy Sheriff Crowley, D.C. Cole, and Harry Easterling. The case to this day remains unresolved and unsolved. With that, this case remains open, but with many unanswered questions that still remain unanswered. Please rate the show and let me know what you guys think about this and the many other cases I've covered. You can follow me on all major social media platforms, YouTube, BitChute, Dailymotion. I'm also on Twitter and Instagram. Links are all down below in the description. If you have a case you'd like me to have a look at or cover, don't hesitate to send me a message. I'm your host, and this has been the Unanswered Questions podcast. Until next time. Next on Unanswered Questions. Daniel Moses was 59 years old at the time of his disappearance in June 2011. His sister Shayla describes him as being a kind and gentle soul